Okay, welcome back. Now we're going to talk about conditioned flavor aversion. So this is kind of a type of aversive Pavlovian condition that perhaps a lot of you are familiar with. And it's quite remarkable in terms of other forms of conditioning, largely because of the large time delay between the conditioned stimulus and the unconditioned stimulus followed by the final unconditioned response. So in a typical experiment, say you eat something, or a real life scenario, I guess, you eat something, say pizza with jalapenos on it or anchovies. Then a couple hours later, you feel sick. And then in the future, you avoid that flavor in the future. So here, the conditioned stimulus is a new flavor. So typically the aversive conditioning works best the more novel the stimulus is. So the more unique that stimulus happens to be, like anchovies being rare and not something that you typically have on pizza. Maybe you do, but if this is the first time you've ever had it, and then you feel sick after it, you typically attribute it to the new flavor quite readily. So the conditioned stimulus is the flavor of the anchovies here. The unconditioned stimulus is feeling sick, or perhaps whatever the stimulus is that makes you feel sick, whether it be bacteria or something like that. And the unconditioned response is sort of the poor feeling of that you get after eating this food. And then finally, the conditioned response is an avoidance behavior of this flavor in the future. So what's particularly remarkable here is how the conditioned stimulus occurs at one time point. Several hours later is when the unconditioned stimulus kind of conditioned response occurs, yet you still form that association quite readily. Perhaps you can think back to a time in which you consumed something that was new or something that you didn't eat very frequently, got very sick, and now have no desire to ever eat that again. This has actually been applied in a variety of scenarios to essentially try and avoid or train predators not to consume certain livestock by farmers. So there was a large program by Garcia in the 1960s and late 50s that looked at, well, can we sort of spike sheep carcasses with a drug that would essentially make the coyotes feel very sick, or the wolves very sick afterwards. And it did actually have some mild effectiveness. One of the drawbacks is that the biggest effectiveness is that the wolves and the sheep, and the coyotes just wouldn't eat any sheep that they found already dead, because that's what sort of made them sick, but it didn't necessarily stop them from killing other animals. But they did still see a substantial reduction in that. So this is kind of an applied usage of that. Outside of that, there's really not very frequent usage. This happens sort of incidentally sometimes. So say, for example, you're trying to give your dog some type of pill. So you hide it in a piece of cheese, and instead of just swallowing it whole, they accidentally bite into the piece of cheese, which then bites into the pill. It becomes super bitter. And then you have a very strong sort of aversive flavor. Maybe they feel a little sick afterwards, and then they won't eat cheese again, or they won't eat whatever it is that you put that in. Again, that can also happen, not really in a training sense, but in an incidental sense. And then now we can also apply Pavlovian conditioning in a sense when we have a elicited response that is undesirable. So typically when we have some type of emotional or fear responses, people will apply counter conditioning. So say, for example, a dog is walking by and this gentleman is out wearing a turkey hat because he is ready for Thanksgiving to come along. This is a pretty scary situation. There's a variety of other stimuli you can have. I think I once for a class rented a panda costume, a bunch of unusual things, so that the dog might be particularly uncomfortable with that. But one of the sort of training techniques that we can do is that instead of having this become sort of a conditioned stimulus that is eliciting a fear response because of its association with other scary things, we can essentially try to counter condition or change the valence or sort of emotional reactivity of this stimulus through Pavlovian conditioning. And how we do that is that we, instead of necessarily trying to desensitize or just repeatedly expose them to this, we present this in the context of Pavlovian conditioning. So whenever, say, this guy jumps out of the bushes, it rains down steaks to your dog. So here you have a conditioned stimulus. It gets associated with an unconditioned stimulus of food, such that whenever this guy pops out, he's a conditioned stimulus for food, and you have a very positive and change that sort of emotional valence of what this stimulus is. This is used very frequently in dog training. So a lot of barking, a lot of jumping sort of on leash are not because your dog is trying to be dominant, it's because your dog is concerned or reactive or has some type of underlying fear, emotional response to whatever that stimulus is. So instead of trying to punish that, what we want to do is try and change that emotional valence to the stimulus to indicate that this stimulus is all right, such that when this guy in a turkey hat pops out of the woods, it means that it's going to rain down food. So then we've turned this into a conditioned stimulus that is positively or appetitively associated with food, which then produces a positive emotional conditioned response. We can also get the opposite to happen when we don't mean conditioning to occur, when we decide that we want to sort of punish or use prong collars or use different types of things that might produce incidental harm. So say you're walking your dog, you walk down the street and you see another dog, your dog starts to pull towards this other dog because it wants to say hello, and you decide to provide a correction by pulling back onto the prong collar, which provides a very painful situation. So from your perspective, you might be seeing like, my dog tried to go at this other dog, so I'm going to punish them and stop them from doing that. From a Pavlovian perspective, what you've just done is that you've turned another dog into a conditioned stimulus that is associated with an aversive stimulus of essentially being pronged along the neck, or very painful stimulus, such that when you see another dog again, the emotional response or the immediate response that is starting to occur, the conditioned response, is essentially preparation for pain, that something bad is about to happen. So you can incidentally condition your dog such that when they see other dogs, that we get a very strong negative emotional response because it's been previously associated with someone pulling on it or a prong collar. This is why when a lot of times we're doing dog introductions, especially with unfamiliar dogs, a lot of times we're like holding on to the leash really, really tight, trying to keep the dogs back. And actually, this is the opposite of what you want to happen. You want the leashes to be really, really loose, because if those dogs have had previous associations, particularly with being pulled away or having painful stimuli when they're going up to meet other dogs, you're essentially reproducing that kind of context. And in reality, you want sort of the leashes to be loose, and you don't want to incidentally condition the dog that when they go up and see another dog, that this means that a painful stimulus is going to come. So this is a version of accidental conditioning that happens all of the time that can lead to pretty significant dog reactivity. If we wanted to counter condition this, so say your dog is already dog reactive and we wanted to sort of try and address the situation, then here's where we can apply the counter conditioning, where whenever your dog sees another dog, instead of it being producing a painful stimulus, we can have it produce a positive or appetitive stimulus like the steak here, such that your dog learns to expect, whenever they see another dog, treats and positive outcomes. So that now when they see another dog, they have a positive conditioned emotional response, such that they're anticipating sort of good things versus a painful stimulus. So then the conditioned response is anticipation of food, salivation, something positive, instead of something negative. So this is one of the main treatments for when we have sort of highly reactive or barking dogs, that we try and make the other dog a conditioned stimulus, such that when they see another dog, that predicts positive things coming. That wraps up our lesson 1 on Pavlovian conditioning. There's so much more to dive into Pavlovian conditioning, but this will wrap up our module 1 for our exam. So hopefully check out our Kahoots as well as the other materials online, and we'll see you in discussion.